Good morning, everyone on the West Coast. Good afternoon on the East Coast. It's great to have you here. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Today, we'll be looking at FAS leading practices and lessons learned. Please join me in welcoming three of North America's top Citrix architects, Michael Schuster, Jeremy Ingram, Željko Masanovic. Todd Shu will be joining us today as our moderator, and myself, Amber. Hi, everyone. I look after the marketing here at Farouk. Michael is the CEO and founder of Farouk Systems and is a recognized Citrix authority in North America. Michael has sat on Citrix's consulting team as an architect for over half a decade as a consulting partner and has led many of Citrix's most successful consulting engagements. As well, he contributes regularly to Citrix's leading practices and documentation. Jeremy has over 20 years experience in the consulting, IT, and managed services arena. He has led CCS delivery engagements as both a senior and principal consultant and has an extensive background in the energy industry. Jeremy has over 20 years experience, Željko is a Citrix solution delivery architect with over 20 years experience, including extensive knowledge in all Citrix virtualization areas, as well as Azure and AWS. And finally, Todd is one of the earliest pioneers of Citrix solutions in North America, who built one of the most successful Citrix practices in the world. His business was acquired by Citrix in 2012, at which point he led Citrix's consulting organization in Canada for 5 years. Today, Todd joins Farouk as both president and partner. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon.
Good afternoon for me. Good morning to the rest of you.
Today, we'll be diving in and taking a closer look at Citrix FAS, the importance of FAS, and some core decisions to consider with deploying it. We'll also review some lessons learned from the field.
Thank you very much, Amber, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Citrix FAS is a product that we're very passionate about at Farouk. In the resource section of the Farouk website, we have a number of blogs on the subject, and we proudly feature this quote describing FAS from Citrix Enterprise Architect and today's panelist, Željko Masanovic. FAS is federating between non-LDAP authentication and LDAP authentication using certificates as virtual smart cards. This succinct and poetic description of FAS is still as accurate today as when it was first published in January of 2019. FAS remains Farouk's preferred method to transition organizations to modern SAML-based authentication solutions, such as Ping ID, Okta, Azure MFA, while doing away with multiple user login prompts. The user experience is benefited by integration of advanced authentication methods while keeping the typical Citrix single sign-on experience that users have come to know and love over the past years. For those of you new to Federated Authentication Services, let's take an opportunity to review what FAS is and how it features in your session launch process and the technical issues it addresses. Firstly, when SAML authentication is integrated into your environment without FAS, we subject our users to 2 authentication prompts before a Citrix session is launched. The first authentication prompt is Storefront, Citrix Gateway, or Citrix Gateway Service, wherever our users would normally authenticate. The second authentication prompt is presented when the desktop or application is launched. So what problems do we solve with FAS? Windows OSs do not natively support SAML authentication. We can't pass a SAML token from an advanced auth product to a Windows OS. Without being to support and handle SAML tokens, we subject users to avoidable authentication prompts in the session launch process. We use FAS as a translation service to pass the unsupported authentication method to the VDA for SSO. Citrix FAS bridges the functional gap between Windows and SAML by use of certificates as virtual smart cards. Within your respective environments, we should refer to FAS prominently as a registration authority. By referring to FAS in high regard, we communicate to other teams in your organizations, especially your security team, just how powerful and critical the FAS component is in the overall session launch process. Deployed in your environment, FAS will sit between your Storefront and your gateway servers. Instead of Storefront passing the credentials to the VDA for single sign-on, Storefront will reach out to FAS for a certificate request. FAS then forwards the request to a certificate authority for issuance. When the user connects to the VDA for their session, the VDA retrieves the certificate for logon instead of using whatever Windows credentials would normally be used for authentication. During the course of the session launch process, the user certificates are only exposed to the VDA. FAS can be used with traditional on-prem access layers consisting of Citrix Gateway and Storefront servers. FAS also integrates with the Citrix Cloud and can be used with Citrix Gateway and Workspace services. Previous to FAS, the only supported method to address SAML authentication was Kerberos constraint delegation. If you supported SAML in XenApp 6.5, you worked with Kerberos constraint delegation, or KCD. FAS is definitely not KCD. If we could look at the FAS family tree, we'd find KCD, but FAS would be a second cousin, not a direct descendant of KCD. The administration experience with KCD was manually intensive work in AD to define delegation with machine objects, which quickly made it impractical from an administration perspective. FAS is much more scalable than KCD and more efficient to administer. FAS is definitely not a storefront authentication method. Again, FAS is part of the overall launch process rather than a method for authentication. We still use the common authentication methods with storefront, which address the front door authentication. FAS provides SSO to VDA session launching. In the event we had to troubleshoot storefront authentication failures, we'd continue to troubleshoot this as a storefront issue and investigate based on the configured authentication method. Next, FAS is not dependent on Citrix ADC. FAS and ADC are frequently deployed together, but FAS is not dependent on ADC for functionality or as a prerequisite for deployment. There's never any direct communication between FAS servers and the ADC. Previously, NetScaler was the only supported method for SAML authentication in the access layer, but you can absolutely deploy FAS without ADC. FAS is not functional in XenApp and Xen desktop bits prior to 7.9. Forget working around official supportability statements. The FAS functionality was only introduced in the 7.9 version of the virtualization products and the storefront version that shipped with the product. Any attempt to deploy FAS with XenApp or Xen Desktop 7.8 or earlier will fail simply because the functionality with the bits simply is not there. FAS is supported with CVAD 7.15 LTSR releases, but FAS itself does not have an LTSR component. So why is FAS important to us, our environment, and our users? The modern digital workspace requires authentication protocols today that Windows doesn't natively support, namely SAML. Ultimately, we're almost exclusively logging into Windows servers or desktops, which have a relatively narrow scope of available authentication options. Modern authentication types, such as SAML, can't be passed to the Windows desktop or server and expected to work. FAS uses the certificate in place of a SAML token to authenticate to Windows. In line with the core tenets of Citrix products, FAS provides flexibility to accommodate multiple advanced BYOD authentication methods to provide the single sign-on experience. FAS is increasingly popular with customers who want to integrate public cloud services into the environment. Potentially the most common of these scenarios is integration with Azure MFA and Azure AD. From the perspective of storefront, this is a SAML-based authentication method, and the FAS provides the single sign-on to the VDA by swapping out the SAML token with a certificate issued per user and passed to the VDA. It's important to note that the certificates passed from FAS are only visible to the VDA. No other environment component is involved with or has visibility to the actual certificate. With contextual access, we can create granular access policies to apps. This can further improve your organization's security posture by reducing the chances there's unintended access to specified published content and the data contained within. The overall user experience has been central to every core architecture decision we've made in CVAD design engagements, and decisions around FAS are no exception. But we would be remiss if we didn't mention the heightened administration experience that FAS can bring to your environment. Ease of initial installation, scalability, the ability to accommodate multiple domains, the ability to accommodate multiple advanced bring your own authentication solutions. All points speak to the heightened user and administration experience of the service. To help ensure success in your FAS deployments, Planning efforts should be heavily prioritized on the front end to ensure you can meet your delivery timelines. Successful planning, especially in larger and more complex environments, will involve multiple teams and require the attainment of multiple approvals. The 80-20 rule absolutely applies here. The more detailed your design, the better. Any misses in your design could very well impede your ability to meet your delivery timelines, especially in the more advanced deployment scenarios. At this time, I'd like to pass the microphone to Željko Masanovic, who will be reviewing installation, core decision points, and common deployment scenarios. Željko.
Hey, Jeremy. Thank you very much, Amber. Thanks. Actually, thank you, the whole Ferog team. So we're going to look it up into installation steps, and this is installing the FAS is pretty straightforward. You don't need anything special. You find a NSI or your installation program, EXE, whatever. You pick it up, you just run it and install it. For installation, you need to be, I'm going to be a little bit descriptive for these steps. So once you install the FAS, that's it. You just follow up the steps. Go next, 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 and once you have it installed, you install it. So the next thing to do with the FAS is to open up your FAS console, and then you need to do several things within a FAS console. You can do it actually from the console. You can do it manually. You don't have to do it from the GUI. So the first thing to do is to deploy templates. So you're going to take those templates, deploy it with your Active Directory. The templates are within a FAS installation package. Once you install it, it's going to be like C, program file, Citrix, blah, 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 certificate templates. Once you deploy those templates into your AD, you need to copy these templates to your CA. Once you copy these templates to the CA, the next steps to do is to authorize the FAS server. That has to be done manually. Actually, all of these steps are kind of quote unquote manual steps. You don't, there's nothing automated. You have to actually do these steps. For these steps, you have to be an enterprise admin within your Active Directory domain. There is no other way around it. Or you can find someone that's enterprise admin. You can, the first two steps, you can do it in PowerShell, you can do it manually, you can just copy, install the certificate templates into AD, you can copy the templates to your CA. But the last step, to authorize the FAS server as a registration authority, you have to actually send a request for authorization and then log into the CA server and then just issue that certificate, issue that permission to the FAS server. Before you end all this, you should be creating the FAS rule. Within a FAS rule, you're going to specify where that FAS is going to be deployed, what VDAs, what users. There are a couple of tricks. Just make sure once you start adding, especially once you start adding the VDAs or storefront servers, the default permission is denied. So if you open up that permission, you want to add your storefront servers. If this is installation on-prem, you're going to see domain computers deny, and then you add storefront services allow, it's going to fail because deny takes precedence. Just make sure that to pay close attention to what permissions are there and what you need to do. Then you will need to import your ADMX and ADML files that are also provided by installation programs. Set up the GPO. Within a GPO, you just specify the file servers. You can refer there. Actually, Mike Schuster has excellent document for the multi-data center deployment of the file servers. I fairly often refer to it when I have the multi-data center deployment. You have to specify file servers, and you have to apply those policies to your storefront servers and your VDAs that you will be actually using with the FAS. Well, I don't want to say it authentication, but with the FAS within authentication process. And the last thing, if you're doing this on-prem, you have to enable a FAS for the storefront store. That's a little PowerShell command. You just run it. Just remember, you enable it on a store. If you have a multiple stores and you want to use FAS for multiple stores, you need to do that for every single store. I've seen this in a double hop scenario when you have a second store for example, you have a desktops, you have applications, and you have that double hop, then you would need that, and you want to use FAS for both, you will need to do that for both stores. This is kind of main thing to remember, that once you enable FAS on the storefront server, you actually enable FAS for the storefront store. The next thing we're going to look it up when it comes to FAS are also the things to consider in the core decisions. So main thing is you have to have internal CA. I don't know if this is a tricky part or not tricky part, but the third-party CA is not supported. As the statement says, you have to have the Microsoft CA infrastructure there. So Microsoft has a very good documentation about how to deploy your CA infrastructure within your environment, and they refer as a single tier, 2-tier, or 3-tier architecture. Single tier architecture is root CA and issuing CA on the same box. 2-tier architecture would be the offline root CA and issuing CAs on 2 different tiers or 2 different levels on 2 different machines or more different machines. And the 3-tier architecture would be the offline root CA, then subordinate offline CAs, and then issuing CAs. The 3-tier infrastructure, I had seen it. You're going to see it in organizations that actually have the CA as within their own environment, and they need the certificates and an internal CA to distribute certificates as they will. The one important thing I also want to mention is if you're designing and preparing to do FAS, or at least implement the FAS for an organization, be ready for some security questions or security team questions. If you work with a good security team, then you're going to get the good questions. Otherwise, so this is a national kindness there, I'm going to be kind. So otherwise, you're going to get some, well, dumb questions from the security team. But most time, what we get from the security team is what rights do we need to install and configure FAS? And I already mentioned you do need to be their enterprise administrator. That's given. A lot of organizations will have issues with that. They will assign someone that you can actually reach out and ask them to do the things they need or that need to be done for all this. The next thing is about certificate templates. Can they be modified? And yes, they can be modified. There are some fields of a certificate, of those certificates that actually we recommend being modified. One of those things is a key length or validity period, etc., etc. Just keep in mind, even though you can modify some fields are recommended not to be modified. So if you're going to modify the field, please refer to our documentation, what is recommended to be modified within a certificate template. Can we narrow the scope of user authenticating against an on-prem storefront store using FAS? Yes. And I mentioned that is actually done within a FAS rules. When you set up FAS rules, you actually define the VDAs and the users that will be logging using FAS services. You can have multiple rules within the same server and apply different rules, so different VDIs or different users. That's also available within a FAS services. The next thing is the HSM, or hardware storage module. Can we use that hardware storage module? Yes, you can. Just make sure to remember that the hardware storage modules are used for enhancing security of the environment, not the performance. And then make sure that those HSMs are actually on a Citrix Ready list or Citrix Ready devices. There are many of them. There are actually many you can pick and choose, but just check it out on a Citrix Ready list. Another one is that we get fairly often when we go into organization is, oh, do we need a CA environment? Yes, you do. Dedicated root CA? Well, yes and no. If you some organizations actually prefer to do separate CA environment just for FAS. And we also, even though if it's just for FAS, we also just recommend, listen, do the 2-tier infrastructure. Have your offline root CA, have your issuing CAs, and then call off the day. If they don't have it, depending on the organization, they may opt for a 2- or 3-tier infrastructure. Just to mention, and I think Jeremy has a note about it. If we see the single-tier infrastructure, we will definitely flag it as a security risk, call off. Be that high or medium security risk, but it is security risk within a single tier infrastructure. The next point I want to mention about FAS is actually performance and scalability. The regular server with 4 vCPUs and 8 gigs of RAM will be able to handle about 10,000 requests. And yeah, that's fine. We always want to eliminate single point of failure. So with every implementation, we always recommend 2 FAS servers. I want to mention that there is no Citrix load balancing as you know it right now. So there is no load balancing lit for the FAS servers. FAS server load balancing is done by well, actually, I don't want to say by GPO, but the GPO actually setting two servers within a GPO will actually provide that redundancy. And we're only talking about redundancy. Resiliency is more or less in question here because we do have 2 redundant servers. The one thing to mention about this high availability is that FAS server actually keeps a certificate within, well, hardware security module, but in general, it keeps the certificate within the registry. So for example, if I log in and FAS server, FAS1 responds to my login and requests a certificate and provides the certificate, that certificate will stay on FAS1 server within a registry. If that FAS1 server fails, when I log in, FAS2 will respond because it's an only server or the next server to respond. It will respond to my request and say, hey, I don't have a certificate for you. I'm going to reach out to CA. Once I reach out to CA, then CA will say, hey, I have a certificate for this guy. Here it is. Just present when he's asked to log in. So that's where the high availability gets in place. This process is really, fast. You're just requesting something, the file that's fairly small, and being presented with that file or store that certificate within a registry. So not real logon impact if one server goes down, but you still want to fix it up. The next thing to think about when it comes to the certificate issuing is the most expensive activity is actually issuing of a certificate. If you're talking about one certificate, yeah, that's fine. It's a one certificate. But once you have an organization that has several thousand users, then you have to think about it. Okay, how do I deal with the performance if I go big bang? I have 5,000 users logging at one time. My FAS server will request 5,000 certificates. My CA server will issue 5,000 certificates. Once you do that, you're going to see significant impact on the FAS server, CA server, and the Active Directory domain controllers, because all of these 3 servers are part of the authentication process when we do this. Well, AD delivery controllers are always part of the authentication process. So how do we deal with that? There is a process you can actually use PowerShell to pre-create certificates, user certificates. So you don't run into this situation. This is not the first time because the validity period of the certificate, user certificate, it's modifiable. You can change it, but by default, I think it's 2 weeks. You can increase it or shorten it out, but whatever you do at the half time, the users will request, the FAS will request the new certificates for the users. So you have 5,000 users on January 1st, then January 3rd, it's going to be 5,000 requesting for new certificates. And January 2nd, you have another 5,000. And you get into this, like every time you need new certificates or reissuing certificates, you're going to get into this spike. So you can pre-create some certificates for the users, spread it out more evenly, get like 500 users at a time, and just keep doing it before you start your big bang implementation. So what we talked about it now, we're going to just look it up at some deployment scenarios. These are the most common, like what you're going to see, are the most common deployment scenarios. The first one is the FAS on-prem. It looks exactly as your environment looks without the FAS services. That's it. The only thing introduction here is the Federated Authentication Service and addition of a IDP, identity provider that's different than your Active Directory. Now, a lot of companies actually are really, really good, especially with being identity providers, and we have it listed right there, like Big Identity, Google, Okta, Azure AD. All of these identity providers are some of identity providers. So Jeremy mentioned earlier that you can't use SAML to log into the Windows, and then yeah, we don't have. It's a different. The SAML is a flat, the flat architecture authentication method. I can maybe talk a little bit more about Azure AD, but I'm going to skip that because that will take a lot of time, and we're already at half an hour right now. If you look it up the stream here and then stream on this slide, this is a FAS on the Citrix Cloud. You can see there is no difference conceptually between those two implementations, just that our FAS is server integrated with the gateway services and workspace services. The authentication process is the same. You hit your gateway service or gateway, you're redirected to your IDP, you put your username and password, you get your SAML ticket, you pass it to the workspace, quote unquote, storefront on-prem. The storefront will actually reach out, enumerate what you have. Once you click on the application, the storefront or workspace service will say, hey, you don't have the valid ticket, and I know I have to use the FAS. I'm just going to reach the FAS to present that certificate, to request and present the certificate to the VDA. Jeremy already mentioned that the certificate is actually only visible to the exposed to the VDA. No other infrastructure components are exposed, and we'll be able to see that certificate. Now that we kind of covered these most common scenarios, we're going into, as you can see on the slide, we're going in a little bit of the black hole, multi-forest implementation. The multi-forest are not as scary as they look like if we start doing the multi-forest implementation with two-way forest trust. Two-way forest trust it's not a big deal. It doesn't represent really big deal. You have two-way trust. You can set up your CAs within a single forest. It just works as a single forest implementation. There are some caveats and some things to consider. I would actually refer to Roger Lamarca, my colleague within Citrix. He has an amazing article about multi-forest implementation. He's done a really good job putting this into the blog. I think Amber will include, or you will get those links included, or at least this link included in the follow-up, the email. The one thing that you actually will be struggling, well, I don't want to say struggling, but you'll have some issues, and then you'll have to do a little bit more investigation and more digging out is once we start working with the selective trust and the selective authentication between two forests. To be honest with you, I could talk about this the whole day. Please look it up in this article, Roger's article. It really covers a lot. It covers the requirements for a successful FAS implementation when we have a selective trust and selective authentication within a multi-forest environment. And I'm going to just mention a couple more things that the cross-forest certificate issuing has to be enabled. Usually it's enabled when you have a two-way trust or multi-way trust between the forests. And if certificate trust in the user domain is also something that you need to be concerned with. Again, please refer to the Rogers document. It is a topic on its own. It gets really complicated. Especially if you do the selective trust. This scenario, actually this represents what we have in the multi-forest implementation. All of these diagrams I'm going to say you can find it on citrix.com. Actually, they're all from the tech zone. So just do the tech zone Citrix, Google Citrix tech zone, and you're going to find amazing articles, really deep dive into the solutions, not just the FAS, but most of the solutions. You can see the two forests right here. The one thing to look it up here, what is important, this is one of the use cases, is the Azure AD Connect actually spanning two forests and synchronizing with a single Azure Active Directory. The one thing here to make this very important is if you decide to use the Citrix Cloud gateway services and the workspace services, The only way to do multi-forest is to synchronize all of your forests within a single Azure Active Directory, because within a workspace services, you can only have, as of right now, you can only have a single Azure AD authentication method. You can have multiple authentication methods, but only one Azure AD. So if you're going to have a multiple on-prem forest, if you want to synchronize, do it within to one Azure AD. I know that's not always feasible. You have, especially when it comes to acquiring different companies, you get a company that already has Azure subscription and Azure tenant. So then you will have to be a little bit more creative when it comes to implementing the FAS in this solution. One option here that I haven't mentioned is that you can actually integrate your on-prem ADCs with the workspace services. And that would be the case if you have a multiple authentication, multiple IDPs, so you can kind of pick and choose and create the policies to define where the users go for what authentication. Next thing is I'm going to pass the baton to my esteemed colleague Jeremy to talk a little bit about common configuration errors.
Yeah, thanks very much, Željko. Lots of great, rich content in there, and I'll just kind of bookend that contribution by saying that with respect to deployment scenarios and core decisions, for our attendees, your takeaway from one of your takeaways from today's conversation should be that you shouldn't be intimidated by implementing this solution. It's not uncommon that we see administrators intimidated by the product and the decision points. While there are some complex deployment scenarios, especially where the multi-forest scenarios are considered, administrators definitely should not be intimidated by the complexity of the initial install or the administration effort that comes with the product. So thanks again, Željko, for.
And I'm just going to jump in. Even I spent a little bit more time talking about multi-forest, especially multi-forest in a selected trust scenario. That's really not that often. Within the last year, I cover Canada and the central US. I had one project that actually had in a full last year that has a selected trust. We do quite a bit with the multiple forest, but that's not that complicated. It's the two-way trust. You can actually do it almost the same thing as you're doing with the single forest implementation. And of course, don't be intimidated. It's nothing complicated. It really, installation by itself is pretty straightforward. All you have to do in a common configuration, especially in the cloud, just add the file service. That's it. You don't need anything. You just configure files, add it to your resource location and your authentication method, and that's it. Call off the day. It's really fast and easy.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So from core decisions, let's move on to some lessons from the field and some common configuration errors. Delegated authentication to ADCs. As I mentioned earlier, we don't require Citrix ADC for deployment of FAS, but when we do integrate with the Citrix Gateway, we need to be sure to go to storefront and fully delegate authentication to the ADC, or else the SSO launch will fail. More times than not, when we're engaged to assist in troubleshooting deployments where the Citrix Gateway is in scope with FAS, this is a common configuration miss. Multi-forest still being prompted at VDA to enter credentials. Realistically, with multi-forest deployments, we should probably expect to see or expect to have to do some troubleshooting to resolve some SSO failures. Typically, the path to successfully troubleshooting the SSO launch and the authentication errors is considerably shorter where two-way trusts are used rather than selective trust and authentication. Next, DCOM authentication ports can be hard-coded to further secure FAS and CA communication. If your organization requires strict mandating of port usage, we can absolutely hard-code the port usage. So administrators have the availability to kind of further satisfy the scrutiny from your respective security teams. Delegate certificates default at 2 years. Out of the box, the delegate certificates have, like the point says, an expiration date of 2 years from when they're initially issued. This default setting is acceptable to bring into production as long as we're tracking and monitoring the revocation lists and certificate validity in the environments. Otherwise, please make sure to set an Outlook reminder 2 years from the date you initially issue the user certificates. The default validity period can be edited. It's not uncommon for us to see organizations issue certificates that could be valid for 5 years or more, considering that this security team sniff test has been satisfied for certificate validity duration. We talked a little bit about the preferred 2 or 3 tier CA architecture. Single tier architecture is not preferred. While it's a valid design decision from a Microsoft perspective, both Farouk and Citrix would flag this architecture decision as a risk if we discovered it on an IA engagement. What constitutes a risk? In the event that the subordinate CA was compromised, the required effort to reissue and redeploy certificates throughout the environment would be burdensome to say the least. With a 2 or 3 tier architecture in place, the scope that those certificates would need to be reissued would be considerably smaller. Some common user errors. In our webinar follow-up email to you, we'll include a link to a great article by Citrix lead architect Sarah Steinhoff. This article is a great resource for troubleshooting common launch errors and VDA SSO errors from an event ID perspective. That also includes steps for remediation there. Continuing with the experiences from the field, we definitely have seen the 1%er scenarios where deployment of FAS is not possible within an organization. So to review these scenarios and possible alternative configurations, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Farouk CEO, Michael Schuster.
Thank you, kind sir, and thanks to you, Angelico, in addition to that, for your content. It's been great so far. So let's talk about where FAS just ain't going to work for you. So FAS obviously does have a number of prerequisites to work correctly, especially when we're talking about the use of cloud IDPs and things of that nature. And from the field, here's some common things that we've come across that have been blockers for customers to be able to successfully use this type of technology. Number one, if we can't sync our passwords or our hashes into, let's say, for example, Azure AD, or we're unable to leverage an IDP for Azure AD to interface with, i.e. an on-prem Azure IDP. So for example, very common for customers to have an Azure AD and Azure MFA configuration in their environment, and then when users go to authenticate at Azure MFA, it directs them to an ADFS solution owned and managed by the customer to complete that auth process. So in absence of like an on-prem IDP even, which could have solved the first problem, it's very common for customers to use an on-prem IDP such as such as ADFS, and then have not sync the passwords or password hashes to Azure AD. Azure AD simply directs the request over to the IDP, authenticates, and goes back through. We're great. But if you can't do either of those two things together or whatnot, then that's going to be a blocker for FAS. The other item would be the inability to use the NPS with Azure MFA extension. So for a bit of education, let's say we'll pick on Azure AD for a moment, but with Azure MFA rather, you can deploy it in 2 modes, key modes. One's using SAML like most of us use, and thus where FAS comes into play. And the other is simply by integrating with Azure MFA as a Radius server. And we do that through the Microsoft NPS server, or policy server, which is essentially a Microsoft Radius type role. And there's an Azure MFA extension that you can add to it that integrates your NPS platform into Azure. Although it works and keeps things a bit simpler, and you can just forget about FAS and use just a good old Radius authentication. The problem with that is you lose out on all the contextual access capabilities. And I believe, don't quote me on, I believe this is similar with a lot of other IDPs that can do similar capabilities. So ping ID I run across fairly often, where ping ID you can interface with either as a SAML IDP, or you can use Radius as well. But at least in the case of Azure AD, and I believe it's still the same with ping ID and some of the other similar technologies, when you're treating it just as a Radius backend for authentication versus the full SAML piece, you may be losing out on contextual access capability. So in the case of Azure AD, that's a real concern for a lot of customers. We run across a lot of customers that using that method just won't work for them. They need these contextual access authentication capabilities, these intelligent analytics that their IDPs provide to help determine risky behavior or risky logins or whatnot, and what have you. So it's a non-starter for some. So, and then last but not least, unable to, but back to that further point there, if we can't do SAML and we can't do NPS, then that's also a non-starter. So the last one here is unable to deploy Microsoft CAs. So the technology that FAS uses is dependent on Microsoft CA infrastructure and enterprise CA infrastructure. I should clarify, standalone CAs by themselves aren't going to fit the bill here. One thing we discovered as early as this morning as well is customers that are using third-party CAs, but then trying to use a Microsoft CA proxy configuration. That also doesn't seem to work. You can get certificates issued, but we still run into Kerberos errors or whatnot at the domain controller level in such scenarios. But obviously depends on the config. But the key point here is Microsoft CA infrastructure needs to be used for this. We can't graft FAS in a supported, let alone functional manner, to a non-Microsoft infrastructure. So if any of these things are not possible, there is some other ways that you can get around using FAS, but Farouk and Citrix Consulting will always defer to FAS as the lead with solution to do SAML authentication to storefront or ADC and able to provide that single sign-on experience to prevent users from signing in twice, once at their access tier and then once when the VDA logs in. First off, about a year or so ago, we did an article related to being able to use Azure MFA with ADC without FAS. And this is not for the faint of heart. It is a fairly advanced ADC configuration that's required. We do need you to be able to configure your Azure AD config to use the ADC as an IDP. So that can be a non-starter for some, although there's ways around that, which we talk about in the blog anyways. And this isn't just unique to Azure AD. The concept of what that blog talks about could be used with other IDPs. We should be able to be used with other IDPs, but in this case, we proved it out with Azure MFA. But essentially, we got a highly complex configuration on the ADC, where Azure MFA defers to the ADC as an IDP to process the login. During that time, we capture the AD credentials for the user, so we can replay them in a later factor using something called the assignment variables configuration on the ADC. And then essentially from a user perspective, it looks seamless. They authenticate to Azure MFA, they log in, great, they land on storefront or wherever they're going, and they're good. They've SSO'd in, because from the ADC perspective, what we've ultimately sent back to, let's say, storefront is LDAP credentials, because we were able to replay them. Alternatively, Okta has, and this is something else we did a write-up on, Okta has another capability with, there's an internal configuration they provided to customers using the legacy basic authentication policies that are being deprecated on ADC. We modernized those in a blog article on how to do it with Nfactor, which is pretty much the lead with for any authentication that we do at Citrix Gateway now and AAA TMV servers. Nfactor is great. It's a bit complicated. It takes a bit to get used to, kind of like riding a bike, but it's very powerful and it's super awesome. But anyways, to the point, Okta does have a configuration that is proven works where essentially you authenticated Okta, so we have SAML, it's set up as a SAML IDP on the ADC, user hits it, when they log into their gateway, gets redirected to Okta, log in at Okta, Okta does what we were doing on the ADC in the other scenario, where it captures those credentials, and then in another factor that's visible to the user, we actually use an LDAP post function to call out back to Okta, grab those users' credentials, and shove them into an LDAP factor on the ADC. So this ultimately allows us to move forward through the platform, through the authentication process, using LDAP authentication versus SAML. So we still use SAML at the front end, but what actually gets sent to the back end environment, storefront, VDAs, all that good stuff, that's all straight up LDAP as we know and love. So there is some alternatives to doing FAS, but for simplicity's sake and just for following leading practices, we're always going to lead with FAS as the solution to do SAML with Citrix.
Sure. So let's get right at it. So number one, why don't Citrix has FAS as a service?
So I'm going to take this one. So this is what did you say, Jeremy? National Kindness Day. I'm going to be kind. I'm not going to say, are you crazy? I'm just going to say, well, I'm just going to say there are actually 2 points to this answer. The first point is, well, FAS is a very security-oriented product. It actually has a registration authority of your CA. So we as a Citrix don't want any liability for someone else's environment. That simple answer. We don't want it. The second part of this answer is, why would you give someone those permissions, those rights? I wouldn't. Like the organizations are even concerned about what's running in the cloud, and then is the dedicated, non-dedicated, shared, not shared. Having FAS service, something like a FAS service as a cloud service, that would be like, no, thank you. But that's the main reason, and it won't be available as a service. I don't think anytime soon.
Yeah, Citrix wouldn't want the liability. There's too much risk. You're literally giving someone the keys to the kingdom, and most customers should have the sense that, no, we probably don't want a third-party vendor having PKI keys to our environment and managing
our environment. Exactly.
My lame joke from last webinar was IT folks that are comfortable doing that are probably the same type of folks that would try and go on Uber to find a babysitter.
Yeah. And were you sitting on that line? I think that was the line of the day from the last webinar.
It was.
Interesting.
Good question.
Yeah. So yeah, don't Uber babysitters. All right. This seems like a lot of added complexity. How are the other vendors solving for this use case of SAML?
I'll take this. So some vendors are solving for it, some aren't. Let's start with Citrix. Obviously, we've got our FAS solution. Great, wonderful, leverages Microsoft CA infrastructure to make the world go round using smart cards. VMware Horizon View does pretty much the same thing using their true SSO technology, and actually came out around the same time as FAS. FAS has been around for a few years now, at least, going 4 or 5, I think. So they solve for it, and it leverages the same general principles and concepts. Windows Virtual Desktops does, I think, unofficially have a way of doing it as long as you've got ADFS in the solution, but there's still a smart card certificate component that comes into play. So it's not exactly eloquent, which is also yet another reason why more often than not, customers don't have a great time with Windows WVD unless Citrix is layered over top. There's still a lot of kinks to be worked out, and anyways, from some background information that we have, Citrix becomes necessary if you want to actually have a really good user experience in WVD. Now, other competitors such as Amazon Workspaces, they don't have a solution at all, last I checked. So there is no way to actually front SAML to Amazon Workspaces and get a nice SSO experience into the VDI. Here's the thing is, a lot of these technologies, Citrix, VMware, what have you, you could use SAML to front access into the environment, but unless you've got some intermediary component like FAS, or in VMware's case, True SSO, to actually take that SAML authentication, somehow translate it into something that Windows natively understands, you'll always end up having to log in a second time once you launch your desktop. I was working with a customer this morning very, very large retailer. They've got a few thousand users, and they've been living without FAS for a couple of years now, didn't even realize it existed. And we're essentially, the user would log into Workspace, and then they'd log in again to launch the desktop. Some people have just accepted that, not knowing any better, but in reality, you can remove that roadblock with FAS and improve the user experience. But again, some have solved for it, others have not.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point there, that some users, or that particular customer didn't even know that this solution was there to utilize.
Yeah, that's cool. And so another question, and for someone who's going to implement FAS, since you guys are all experienced project leaders, what are the prerequisites? What are the things that you need to be prepared for before you implement FAS?
Oh, I can take this one. Well, not much, to be honest with you. The main thing that you have to have is the internal CA. So if you have internal CA or you have Microsoft CA configured in your environment, you're already ready to implement FAS. Now, you need 2 servers per resource location or per data center or whatever you do it. And then that's about it. That's what I'm saying. It's not that complicated to implement and configure FAS. The only prerequisite, well, the domain levels have to be, I think the minimum domain level is 2008 R2, if I'm not mistaken. It might move to 2012 R2. I would really have to check those prereqs, but other than that, it's just, you need a CA. You need internal CA that will actually issue certificates on behalf of the users. And that's pretty much it. That's the main prerequisite.
Okay.
Going back to, just to add to that, if we go kind of back to our topic where we were talking about our installation, again, the installation is very straightforward. And you're gonna have three tent poles in your installation. Deploying the certificate template, setup of your certificate authority, and authorization of the service. The other items that you'll consider is your Windows PKI, your integration with storefront, scalability, server sizing, server team inquiries, and that should just about cover it.
2012 functional level is what you got to target, by the way.
Okay, 2012. Yeah. So if you have 2008 R2, you have to upgrade your functional level of your forest and the domain.
Yeah, the prep work really, in my mind, really comes, again, what you folks have alluded to before about the planning. It's really all about the planning is where most of the focus is. The security design decisions that come into play. Do we have to use a CA in a different forest? Do we have CAs in our own forest? Stuff like that. Do we have to support forests that we don't have trusts with? And do we want to do shadow accounts for that? That's a lot of the work's in the decisions, but the prerequisites really are, hey, do we have servers in the resource locations? And hey, do we have CAs that we can integrate with? That's the basic.
Also, make sure for everybody to understand the authentication process, because you will most likely have 2 different authentication processes between external users that are going from work at home to users that are actually sitting in the office. I don't know if anybody's sitting in the office right now. There are some, but where are you going to do that? Do you require, I don't know, Okta to log in remotely? If you require Okta to log in remotely, or Azure MFA or Ping Identity, if you're remote, then what account are you using? Like Azure, as Mike mentioned before, you can use the radius with Azure AD. I haven't seen anybody does that. They usually picked up Azure AD plus MFA authentication right out of the box from Azure AD, but only when you log in from home to your environment, to your whatever workspace server, gateway services, or gateway on-prem. It doesn't really matter. If you're in the office, do you really need to use any of the SAML solutions? Maybe you do. Some of the customers do. Then just understand the authentication process and method that you're using, and what do you need to do to actually get your VDA to accept your credentials in a form that are acceptable, be that username and password or the certificate-based authentication, X509 certificate-based authentication.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us today, for taking time out of your busy schedule. Also wanted to thank our panel, Željko, Michael, Jeremy, and of course, Todd, for being here today and helping us out. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, folks.
All right.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye.